The prevailing narrative of hypersonic missile threats is a deliberate misdirection. The systemic vector that guarantees escalation is not a kinetic first strike. It is silence. A coordinated, non-attributable attack designed not to create a crater, but to induce a national solvency crisis through a total information blackout. CSIS analysis indicates the blueprint targets two key vulnerabilities: submarine data cables and low-orbit satellite constellations. The objective is not destruction, but paralysis, severing the nation's digital nervous system from its global economic and military appendages. The cost is mathematically insignificant. The impact is total. This protocol creates the strategic nightmare scenario: the blind Leviathan, a superpower, deafened and isolated, unable to confirm asset locations, process transactions, or verify chain of command. Faced with instantaneous economic collapse, its only remaining option becomes a launch-on-warning posture, a desperate, high-end kinetic response to an invisible enemy. This is not a failure of deterrence. It is the final, programmed act of a system pushed past its breaking point. The motive for modern conflict is misdiagnosed. It is not ideology, it is solvency. A state facing internal economic collapse cannot afford a popular, prolonged conventional war. According to analysis from CSIS, Russia's pivot was a direct function of this principle. Faced with mounting domestic liabilities, the state required an external dynamic to manage its internal crisis. This is not a war of choice. It is a balance sheet correction disguised as geopolitics. A state with no liquidity cannot fund a peer-to-peer kinetic fight. It is forced to pivot to asymmetry. The operational blueprint is clear. Leverage low-cost, high-impact vectors that bypass conventional defenses. Ukraine's entire development of a secure AI training platform exists for one reason: to counter the mathematical efficiency of Russian drone swarms. This is the signature of a solvency crisis: the replacement of expensive hardware with cheap, intelligent, and expendable assets. This economic weakness is the true vector of attack. An adversary understands it is cheaper to trigger a systemic collapse than to destroy a carrier group. Our domestic liabilities are pre-calculated targets on their escalation matrix. The affordable housing crisis in San Diego is not a civilian news story. It is a documented, quantifiable vulnerability. It represents a single point of failure that can be exploited to cascade through the national economy. The blueprint for this attack is already in use. Look at Iran. The mere threat of U.S. kinetic action is enough to destabilize its economy, forcing it to delegate import powers and manage internal chaos. The attack does not require a single shot to be fired. The goal is to weaponize an adversary's own fragility against them, creating a liquidity trap from which there is no escape. It's a non-kinetic siege. The final motive is desperation. A nation-state, like any entity facing bankruptcy, will liquidate its most powerful assets as a final act. When the kinetic cost of a conventional war becomes mathematically impossible, an asymmetric warfare is the only affordable option. You have created a strategic trap. The declining power is cornered. Its final deterrent becomes a disproportionate launch-on-warning strike because the cost of doing nothing is guaranteed systemic collapse. The economics of lethality have inverted. A detailed analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, presents the brutal mathematics. A $5 million main battle tank, the product of a legacy industrial base, can be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This is a 10,000 to 1 cost asymmetry. It is not a battlefield anomaly. It is a systemic shift in the kinetic cost model of modern warfare. This equation renders decades of conventional military procurement strategy obsolete. The asset is no longer the tank. The liability is the tank. This radical cost inversion enables a protocol known as the democratization of violence. The capacity to project lethal, precision force is no longer the exclusive domain of solvent nation-states. It is now a commodity. The barrier to entry is not a national treasury, it is a credit card. As Ukraine deploys AI training platforms to counter swarms of Russian drones, the blueprint becomes clear. Warfare is shifting from a contest of capital-intensive platforms to a battle of algorithmic attrition and mass-produced threats. This is the new vector for asymmetric leverage. This creates the strategic trap. An economy burdened by domestic liabilities, such as the San Diego housing crisis, suffers a solvency crisis. It cannot sustain the financial burn rate required to fund a conventional, platform-centric war against adversaries deploying disposable, low-cost assets. The mathematical certainty is that a prolonged conflict becomes unaffordable. Cornered and its conventional deterrence nullified by economics, the declining power is incentivized toward a launch-on-warning posture, where its only remaining response is disproportionate escalation, using high-end kinetic force not as a first choice, but as a final, desperate act of solvency. The strategic landscape is not defined by traditional borders, but by designated gray zones. These are not random hotspots of chaos. They are proxy laboratories. RUSI analysts identify regions with pre-existing internal fractures, like those prompting recent travel and safety warnings, as prime staging grounds. The objective is not to conquer territory, but to stress test new vectors of asymmetric attack in a live-fire environment, far from the primary target. Ukraine is the primary data collection event. The publicized launch of secure AI training platforms to counter drone swarms is a public admission of a new arms race protocol. Source number 1. This is where the kinetic cost of attrition warfare is being calculated to the decimal point. The blueprint is not for a peer-to-peer conflict. It is a template for overwhelming a system whose domestic liabilities, like a housing solvency crisis, make a sustained defense mathematically impossible. This protocol is mirrored in the economic sphere. The persistent instability engineered by the mere threat of war, as seen with Iran, is a deliberate financial weapon. Source number 3. It is a non-kinetic siege designed to test the breaking point of a nation's import-export solvency. The data gathered in these proxy labs informs the final calculus: how to combine low-cost kinetic swarms with targeted economic pressure to trigger a systemic collapse in a declining power, forcing a launch-on-warning response. Launch-on-warning is not a decision. It is a pre-authorized protocol, a systemic response to a detected kinetic launch by an adversary. The logic is zero-sum. If you wait for physical confirmation of impact, you lose the capacity to retaliate. The protocol exists to guarantee a second strike. The modern vector for attack is not the missile itself, but the data stream that verifies its existence. A sophisticated cyber attack creates the fog of digital war. Early warning systems, the radars, the satellites, are not jammed, they are blinded. The data simply stops. In this engineered void, the commander is trapped. The protocol, as analyzed by RUSI, interprets a sudden loss of signal after an initial alert as a high-confidence indicator of a successful decapitation strike. To wait for more data is to assume you have been annihilated. The system forces a launch out of fear, not of the enemy, but of the protocol's own internal logic. This military dilemma is an accelerant for an underlying solvency crisis. CSIS reports confirm that a nation weighed down by domestic liabilities, like the San Diego affordable housing crisis, lacks the economic depth for a prolonged conventional conflict. Economic instability, driven by the threat of war, degrades readiness, as documented in Iran's economy. Adversaries understand this blueprint. They will not initiate a symmetric fight. Instead, they will use low-cost, asymmetric vectors, like the AI-driven drone swarms Ukraine now trains against, to trigger the digital fog of war. The objective is not to defeat us kinetically, but to force us to trigger our own strategic trap, revealing an insolvency that makes the final escalation a mathematical certainty. Adversary cost-benefit analysis is no longer measured in carrier groups. It is measured in kinetic cost per point of economic damage. The conflict in Ukraine serves as a global, open-source R&D platform, launching secure AI training for drone swarms that are mathematically impossible to intercept cost-effectively. CSIS analysis confirms these asymmetric systems are designed for one purpose: to bypass conventional defenses and strike at the true American center of gravity, its fragile domestic economy. The target vector is not arbitrary. It will be a location where strategic military value intersects with acute civilian economic liability. The affordable housing crisis in San Diego, as documented by county officials, is not a headline. It is a pre-calculated vulnerability. A disruption to the port of San Diego, a critical node for both naval power projection and regional commerce, would create an economic shockwave that the underlying social fragility cannot absorb. This is the blueprint. Use a kinetic catalyst on a pre-existing solvency crisis. The calibration forecast. Within 12 months, expect a coordinated, attribution-impossible blackout at the port of San Diego. A swarm of autonomous, non-explosive drones will execute a precision strike on primary data and power substations, triggering a logistics shutdown for 48 to 72 hours. No state will claim responsibility. No definitive forensic evidence will exist. It is not an attack. It is a probe to collect data on the escalation calculus of a power constrained by its own internal liabilities.